Pride and Sensuality, a Darcy and Elizabeth short story, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Forward. Mrs. Phillips's vulgarity was another and perhaps a greater tax on his forbearance, and though Mrs. Phillips as well as her sister stood in too much awe of him to speak with the familiarity which Bingley's good humour encouraged, yet whenever she did speak, she must be vulgar. Nor was her respect for him, though it made her more quiet, at all likely to make her more elegant. Elizabeth did all she could to shield him from the frequent notice of either, and was ever anxious to keep him to herself, and to those of her family with whom he might converse without mortification. And though the uncomfortable feelings arising from all this took from the season of courtship much of its pleasure, it added to the hope of the future, and she looked forward with delight to the time when they should be removed from society so little pleasing to either, to all the comfort and elegance of their family party at Pemberley. Pride and Prejudice, Volume the 3rd, Chapter 18. Chapter 1. Such a place as this. If it is true that a young man's, shall we say, proportions are commensurate with the size of his fortune, then there is all the more reason to pity our poor Lydia, even if her husband is so very handsome. Oh, how Elizabeth wished she were a magician that she might disappear. Better still, I would make Aunt Phillips disappear. Any mention of the nefarious George Wickham in her betrothed's presence was discomforting in and of itself. Of course her aunt would have no way of knowing that Mr. Darcy had been the means of uniting Elizabeth's youngest sister Lydia with the man who happened to be his worst enemy, in order to save the Bennet family's reputation after the careless couple's shameful elopement. Even now, Mr. Darcy could barely countenance the sound of Wickham's name. Her aunt's mentioning of Wickham's unmentionables, regardless of the company, was unconscionable. The second of 5 daughters, Miss Elizabeth Bennet could never boast of being on intimate terms with her Aunt Phillips. Elizabeth's mother, Mrs. Frances Bennet, and her mother's sister, Mrs. Agatha Phillips, had always been as close as siblings could be. Now that Mrs. Bennet had been the means of affording her sister the honour of such venerable connections, Mrs. Phillips was at Longbourn far more often than not. In fact, the only time that Mrs. Phillips had not spent an evening with the Bennets of late was when the family had dined at Netherfield Park. A woman of 44, who might once have been considered quite comely, Mrs. Phillips imparted a knowing smile at Mrs. Bennet before continuing her speech. "It follows that our Lizzie shall be a very happy wife indeed, with no reason at all to repine." Surely my embarrassment can be no worse. Elizabeth fought to suppress a grimace. Given Aunt Phillips's want of vulgarity, I wonder that she makes no mention of the size of Mr. Bingley's estate, with hints of its relevance to matters ill-suited for mixed company. True to form, Mrs. Phillips's eagle-eyed gaze swooped upon Elizabeth's eldest sister. "The same might be said of Jane, I am sure." Elizabeth and Jane exchanged glances. Both young ladies coloured, but remained speechless. Experience had taught Elizabeth that any attempt to rein in her aunt when she prattled on that way only emboldened her instead. When Elizabeth looked at Darcy, she saw he was looking at nothing in particular. How she admired his ability to accomplish such an air of indifference, for she was certain that were she forced to suffer such foolishness from his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she would not be nearly so collected. Since the engagement, Elizabeth had suffered too many evenings such as this to count, and every one found her recalling Darcy's poorly chosen words during his first proposal, when his startling avowal of ardent love for her had been anything but endearing. That had happened many months ago in Hunsford, and as poignant as had been the occasion, they had agreed to put its remembrance behind them for all time. Elizabeth folded her hands in her lap and commenced studying the intricate patterns in the rug. Surely he must recall his own misgivings during such moments as this. Indeed, his sentiments had been harsh. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your 3 younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Pardon me. It pains me to offend you, but amidst your concern for the defects of your nearest relations and your displeasure at this representation of them, let it give you consolation to consider that to have conducted yourself so as to avoid any share of the like censure is praise no less generally bestowed on you and your elder sister than it is honourable to the sense and disposition of both. Yet even his good opinion of her beloved sister Jane had not been enough to persuade him of Jane's inherent goodness. I will only say farther that from what passed that evening, my opinion of all parties was confirmed, and every inducement heightened which could have led me before to preserve my friend from what I esteemed a most unhappy connection. Aside from his ignorance of Jane's affections for his friend Bingley, what criticism had he levelled against her family that proved false? Truly, her sister Lydia's behaviour was most egregious, but Elizabeth and Darcy weathered the storm, largely owing to his benevolence. Unfortunately, there was nothing to be done about the present discomfort, but suffer it. Between her mother's ridiculousness and her Aunt Phillips's vulgarity, Elizabeth knew not which of the two was worse. She shifted in her seat. I must remind myself of the great advantages afforded by the distance between my present life in Hertfordshire and my new home in Derbyshire. How she looked forward to removing her soon-to-be husband from her Meryton relatives. Thank heavens Uncle and Aunt Gardiner's society is as pleasing to Mr. Darcy as it is to me. Her maternal uncle, Mr. Edward Gardiner, was a sensible gentleman-like man, well-bred, agreeable, and greatly superior to his sisters. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and to Elizabeth's delight, her aunt and uncle had been included in the invitation to dine at the home of Mr. Darcy's noble relations, Lord and Lady Matlock, when Elizabeth was in town. Oh, if my Meryton relatives were half as agreeable as my London relatives, then I would not have cause to feel as wretched as this. Wanting to do something, anything to alter the path of her aunt's discourse, Elizabeth stood and casually walked to another part of the room. Mr. Darcy evidenced no indication of having heard a word Mrs. Phillips uttered, which Elizabeth supposed was a good thing. Her aunt's want of impropriety did not carry over nearly so well with Mr. Darcy as it likely did with Mr. Bingley, although in this case even Bingley's face bore a slightly deeper shade of astonishment than usual. Her arms folded, Elizabeth watched the raindrops trailing down the window-pane. Though soothing, the steady patter did nothing to dispel the agonizing discomfort brought on by her relations' ridiculous banter. Were it not for this downpour, I would head outside for an evening stroll with Mr. Darcy, solely the two of us. Thoughts of escaping recalled her to an evening stroll on the heels of their engagement when they had slipped away from their company and found a secluded spot in the garden. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She traced her fingers across her lips. A tiny shiver danced along her spine. Nothing could ever compare to the joy I felt. How uncertain she had been the instant his lips met hers for the very first time. Nervous, trembling, her thoughts clouded with uncertainty. Would she even know how to respond to his kiss? However, he had been so patient, his lips firm against hers, yet ever so tender. Moreover, the affectionate gaze he bestowed once their lips parted and their eyes met told Elizabeth all she needed to know. For all those things she had yet to learn about making love, he would be a most attentive teacher. Approaching footsteps stirred a hope inside her that Darcy was seeking her out. Prepared to be pleased, she opened her eyes. Ruffling skirts smothered that hope. Cringing, she closed them tightly for a second. Elizabeth sucked in her breath, released it, and then turned. "Lizzie, what have you done to Mr. Darcy? Unless my old eyes are deceiving me, he is a full stone lighter since he returned to Hertfordshire." Mrs. Phillips threw a furtive glance over her shoulder in Darcy's direction, and then returned her full attention to Elizabeth. "Man does not live on love alone, and I understand the winters in Derbyshire can be quite harsh. I wager a strong wind is likely to come along and carry him away. What a shame that would be." This Mrs. Bennet must have overheard, for she sprang from her seat and hastened across the room to where Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips stood, and joined the conversation, her voice teeming with concern. "Now that you mention it, I must say that I, too, have noticed how he merely pushes his food around on his plate. Why, he barely touched his venison, and I always supposed it to be one of his favourites. Oh, Lizzie, you must speak with cook at once, and have something prepared more to Mr. Darcy's likings." Mrs. Phillips's declarations, however lacking in refinement and sensitivity, were not without foundation, for it was true that Mr. Darcy's appetite for food was nowhere nearly so robust as Elizabeth remembered from when they had dined at Netherfield Park during the earliest days of their acquaintance, or during the meals they had taken together at Rosings Park, his aunt's estate in Kent. But then again, Elizabeth was not one to talk, for her own appetite had waned, overtaken too many times by a swarm of butterflies in her stomach whenever she and her betrothed were in company. The best indication of her change in appearance was the spectre of her dresses, which draped her body a bit looser, prompting her to take them in an inch or so, for vanity's sake. Elizabeth pursed her lips. "Here is my chance to rescue Mr. Darcy from my aunt's society." Just as Mr. Bennet had a favourite chair to which he relegated himself whenever social decorum forced him from the sanctuary of his library, Darcy too had commandeered his own place in Longbourn's west parlour, one that offered him a bit of solace as he spent yet another evening in his role as a dutiful future son-in-law. Despite weeks of courtship, the liveliness of the Bennet household was something to which he had not quite accustomed himself. That evening, Mr. Bennet had eschewed the burden of social decorum altogether, leaving Darcy and Bingley to fend for themselves in a room full of chattering women. There Darcy sat by the fire, doing his best to meditate on the pleasures bestowed from his Elizabeth's fine eyes. He was too much concerned with when at last he might be alone with his future wife to worry over much about the nonsense that sprang from Mrs. Bennet's and her sisters' mouths. Just sitting in the room with those two women was torture, and much like evenings he had spent in his aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh's parlour, he had learned that the best way to avoid engaging in discourse with those who often spoke solely for the purposes of hearing themselves speak was to avoid making eye contact. He must avoid making eye contact, refrain from looking at the clock, his pocket watch, anything that would encourage his future mother-in-law to make a fuss. Even after weeks in his company, it seemed she was exceedingly prone to converse with him when she thought she might do something to garner his approbation. Darcy had lost count of the number of evenings he had spent thus. Little did it matter now, for there was only one thought that consumed him: 2 nights more. His eyes pored over Elizabeth's light and pleasing figure. A second earlier, and I would have been the one by Elizabeth's side, instead of her loquacious aunt. It was all he could do to master his sensibilities when they were as close as this. Indeed, our wedding night cannot come soon enough. every moment spent apart from his betrothed he best described as lonely. Such were the sentiments of a man who had never thought of himself as missing out on anything, at least not until he met her, and never more than during the span of time between his ill-worded marriage proposal, which Elizabeth rightly spurned, and that glorious day when she accepted his hand. To think it had been nearly 3 months ago when, believing he had lost her forever, he had endured the lonely journey back to town after he had done his part in reuniting her sister Jane with his friend Charles Bingley. 1,000 happy thoughts accompanied him on his return trip to Hertfordshire once he had received the life-changing intelligence from Lady Catherine de Bourgh, teaching him to hope for a future life with Elizabeth, as he dared not allow himself before. Setting aside his outrage that her ladyship had broken every rule of decorum in coming to Hertfordshire and accosting Elizabeth, he realized what she had to say upon confronting him in town had met with his ardent appreciation. According to his aunt, Elizabeth's words bore a hint of regret that she could not declare that she was indeed engaged to him, as his aunt had accused. And what was worse to her ladyship's way of thinking, Elizabeth had adamantly refused to promise she would never enter into an engagement with him should he ever make her an offer. How could he help being encouraged by this astounding turn of events, brought about by his aunt's meddling? He knew Elizabeth's disposition well enough to be certain that had she been absolutely irrevocably decided against him, she would have acknowledged her sentiments to Lady Catherine with unrestrained frankness and unequivocal forthrightness. On the other hand, even if he had read more into his aunt's declarations than Elizabeth's words truly had signified, he knew in his heart he had to give the matter of winning Elizabeth's hand one last chance before he could silence himself on the subject forever. Despite all his aunt's dire prognostications, having surrendered his heart to Elizabeth so long ago, and having won her heart in turn, for Darcy no amount of mortification proved unbearable, even the near constant society of her Hertfordshire friends and acquaintances. Darcy crossed his legs. I can well imagine that Elizabeth would find evenings in company with the likes of Lady Catherine as equally discomforting as I find spending time with Mrs. Phillips. At least Mrs. Phillips gave no appearance of disdaining him, whereas his aunt openly despised his betrothed. Her letter to him, decrying the folly of his marital plans, had been scattered with language so abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that he determined should he never lay eyes on his aunt again, it would be just as well. My, how things have changed! For I recall the time when I never thought I would find myself in such a place as this. Yet here I sit. What's more, there is no place on earth I would rather be, if it meant being separated from my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. His eyes met hers from across the room. Her amazing, dark, bewitching eyes. Darcy shifted in his seat as an arousing sense of anticipation washed over him, and he wished they were not merely betrothed, but already man and wife. Then she tore her eyes away from his, and she hastened out the door. Where is Elizabeth going? Whatever had been the impetus, watching Elizabeth bolt from the room sent his heart racing. A notion of following her consumed him. Does she truly mean to abandon me, forcing me to endure her insufferable aunt alone? What have I done to warrant such an unenviable fate? Chapter 2. The Key to His Heart. Elizabeth stood behind the partially open door, which afforded her just enough seclusion to espy her betrothed without drawing everyone's attention. Will my heart always sing this same sweet serenade each and every time I behold his striking person? He had that certain air about him that distinguished him from every other person in the room. Everything about this man excited her. The soul-piercing look in his eyes, the velvety rich baritone of his voice, the way he moved across the floor. Elizabeth's mind wandered to the time she first saw him at the Meryton Assembly, and that intense moment when their eyes met from across the crowded room. What intrigue had surrounded his entrance? Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, the young master of Pemberley in Derbyshire, tall, handsome, and most importantly, he was a single man with more than £10,000 a year. Then everyone soon discovered him to be proud and above his company. Elizabeth had been on the receiving end of the sternest of his disapprobation when she overheard him tell his friend Charles Bingley that she was fairly tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt him. Oh, what a mistake that had turned out to be, subjecting them to conflict and drama, as Elizabeth swore she would hate him for all eternity. How she had despised him for his arrogance and what she had once believed as his indifference towards the feelings of others. What a thin line it is between love and hate indeed, for his having since proved himself to be the best man she knew, she was certain that her love for him would last for all eternity. Elizabeth, now fully aware that this man, who might have any woman he desired, did not look at her to find fault, but out of love and affection could say with certainty that he was decent and kind. His selfless generosity on my sister's behalf is a testament to his goodness. Falling in love with Mr. Darcy became so easy once she had made a start. She would not venture to say he was without fault. However, her Aunt Gardiner had it right upon first making his acquaintance at Pemberley, when she said he had not an ill-natured look. She went on to say there was something pleasing about his mouth when he spoke, and there was something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one an unfavourable idea of his heart. A wave of heat spread over her body when, after a moment, her eyes met his. Mischief graced her countenance as Elizabeth, with a slight shift of her head, silently beckoned he join her. Darcy uttered a few imperceptible words to Bingley, who sat next to him, and then stood and walked to her. Undetected by the room's other occupants, Elizabeth captured his hand and started leading him down the hall. "What are you about?" "You looked as though you needed rescuing. Pray follow me." "Where are we going?" "For once, I find my aunt and my mamma gave voice to reason. You, sir, appear in great need of sustenance. I have been busy taking measures to redress their complaints." "I wondered what I had done to cause you to abandon me earlier." "Apparently you did not hear my mamma decrying your emaciated state." "I dare say one would have had to be deaf not to have heard her." "Mr. Darcy, your abundant power of ignoring the ridiculous amazes me." "Actually, my mind was more agreeably engaged, contemplating the number of days until I am allowed to sate my desire for sustenance of a different kind." Elizabeth bit her lower lip to mask her astonishment. "Well, sir, I do hope you will enjoy what I am offering instead." Darcy's expression upon entering the room and espying the arrangements Elizabeth had made was just what she had hoped it would be. Wide-eyed, with a stunning smile that unvaryingly unleashed waves of joy in her heart. In the short time she was away, Elizabeth had exercised extraordinary measures, overseeing the preparation of a small feast of seasonal fruits, assorted breads, cheeses, and wine for Darcy's pleasure. "What is this?" "We cannot have the master of Pemberley return to his estate so thin and frail that he risks being unrecognizable." "Heaven forbid." Elizabeth led Darcy to the table. "I invite you to have a seat. "After you, my love," said he. "Actually, I mean to serve you." "If that is the case, then—" Darcy looked at the young woman stationed by the side table. "It appears your services are no longer required." The poor girl's lower lip quivered. Elizabeth hurried to the servant's side and placed her hand upon her shoulder. "Fear not, Sarah. I am certain what Mr. Darcy meant to say is, you may be excused." Relief poured over her face as Sarah dropped a grateful curtsy. "Oh, thank you, Miss Elizabeth." The girl wasted no time quitting the room. Darcy was still standing when Elizabeth returned to his side. "Again, I invite you to have a seat," she said in an impertinent, albeit teasing manner. Darcy rested his hands on the back of the chair next to his own, his stance equally as resolute. Elizabeth arched her brow. "How shall I serve you properly if I am seated beside you?" Darcy lifted his brow in turn. "Once you make a start, I am rather certain you will do the job nicely." I sense a challenge buried in his tone. Whereas Elizabeth's courage always rose with any attempt to intimidate her, she meant to have fun this evening. Thus she sat in the chair in response to his determined attitude, in order that they might get on with her scheme. Upon sitting, Darcy said, "This is quite a feast you have spread before me. Surely I'm not expected to partake of all this alone." "I suppose I might have a small bite or two, but not before I have made sure you are fully satiated, sir." Darcy picked up the glass and took a sip of wine, all the while regarding Elizabeth with a piercing stare. Elizabeth swallowed in an effort to settle the volcanic flutters erupting inside her. Wanting, nay needing, to do something that might calm her, she reached for a plate and began filling it with food. When she picked up a slice of apple, he reached for her hand and guided it to his mouth. "You did say you would serve me, did you not?" Again she swallowed. "Indeed." Elizabeth held the apple slice just so, and Darcy took his first bite and then another until it was all gone. Her fingers, now upon his wonderfully soft lips, sent her pulse racing. Flushed, she lowered her hand. Pleased by the steady rise and fall of her chest, he imagined his fingers trailing along the edge of her décolletage, followed by his lips. Darcy picked up a slice of fruit and raised it to Elizabeth's lips. She opened her mouth and accepted his offering. He traced his now empty fingers across her lips. Their gazes met. Elizabeth saw a bit of teasing in his eyes that eased a bit of the unrest coursing deep inside her body. Darcy reached over, picked up his wineglass, and brought it to Elizabeth's lips. She took a sip and then another, enjoying the sensations of wine washing down her throat, easing her reservations, and ushering in a bout of playfulness. "It is I who should be serving you, sir." "I much rather we take turns nourishing each other." "Then it is my turn." She picked up a piece of bread and smothered it with sweet and succulent preserves. She raised it to his lips. Again, Darcy opened his willing mouth and encouraged her to feed him. A tiny drop of spread lingered on her finger. Darcy took her hand and commenced bestowing a fair amount of attention upon each trembling digit, including those that showed no evidence of needing such ardent consideration. "Oh, Mr. Darcy, you were indeed in need of sustenance." "I am famished, and in a manner that I am likely to remain at least until—" "Until—" With utmost affection, Darcy kissed the base of Elizabeth's hand. Her skin was soft and warm, with the sweet lingering scent of rosewater. Unable to stop himself, he kissed her palm tenderly. She gasped. Her hand trembled. For so long he had found himself wishing for such a moment alone with Elizabeth, although sitting at the table in the dining parlour of a household as lively as Longbourn was hardly conducive to his purposes. His mind drifted. In mere days he would bring his bride to Pemberley, where he would be at liberty to enjoy such pleasures as those dancing through his imagination in any number of Pemberley's rooms at any time he would like. An opening door and swooshing fabrics ripped Darcy from his dreams of making love to his bride. Darcy released Elizabeth's hand. Hoping his face did not betray his frustration, he stood. "Oh, there you are, Lizzie. I wondered where you had run off. I see you followed my advice and had cook prepare a light repast for Mr. Darcy. Oh, sir, I do hope you find it to your liking." Without awaiting his response, Mrs. Bennet spun round on her heels. "Where in heavens is Sarah? She should be here. I shall speak to Hill at once." Elizabeth said, "No, Mamma, you need not bother. I told Sarah that her services were not needed." "Not needed? It is her job to be here to attend our honoured guest. Oh, pray you will forgive this lapse, Mr. Darcy." Darcy cleared his throat. "I am not offended, madam. Please do not trouble yourself on my behalf. In fact, I shall deem it a great service if you would give this matter no further consideration." Ever desiring to garner his approbation, Mrs. Bennet studied the table. "Mr. Darcy needs a more substantial meal, Lizzie. I shall speak with cook myself." "No, Mamma, this is quite sufficient." "Well, if you are certain." After a moment, she beckoned Elizabeth to her side. Speaking in a hushed tone, she said, "Mind you, Lizzie, it does not do to underestimate Mr. Darcy's appetite. Surely such a man has cultivated quite a discerning palate, and is, no doubt, a connoisseur of the finest tastes in life." Elizabeth suffered embarrassment, not simply for herself, but for her betrothed as well. She said nothing, determining it was the quickest way to encourage her mother's departure. Some moments later, Mrs. Bennet reluctantly took her leave. Elizabeth had not forgotten the air of intrigue pursuant to Mr. Darcy's unspoken promises that had filled the room just moments earlier. She wasted no time in her endeavour to recapture it. After reclaiming her own seat, she coaxed him to resume his former attitude. "Come, I must have you eat something more." With no second thoughts over the liberties she exercised, Elizabeth arranged a linen napkin on his lap and commenced where they had left off. Mr. Bennet wandered into the room and looked around. There, Jane and Bingley sat in the corner doing what they often did, bestowing their attention on no one other than themselves. His daughters Mary and Kitty sat in the opposite corner, behaving normally, the former reading a book, and the latter twisting her curls mindlessly about her fingers. His wife and her sister Phillips sat huddled on one of the sofas. "Where is Lizzie and Mr. Darcy?" Mrs. Phillips and Mrs. Bennet swapped surreptitious glances. The latter said, "I am sure I do not know where the two of them have gone. At first Lizzie quit the room, and then Mr. Darcy made some excuse and disappeared as well. Is that not true, sister?" "Indeed. However, I would not worry too much, for no doubt wherever they are together, doing what young people violently in love are wont to do with the eve of their nuptials so soon upon them. I am surprised that Jane and Mr. Bingley remain in company." She said in a hushed voice meant only for the three of them, "Perhaps that young man has a better regulation of his passions than his friend." Suspecting his wife and her sister were keeping secrets, the silver-haired patriarch raised his bushy brows. This was his favourite daughter that they were speaking of, and while he had no doubt of her sensibility, he was not unaware of the proclivities of young lovers in love. True, he had grown rather fond of Mr. Darcy, But even now, with 20-odd years of wedded life to his credit, he had not forgotten what it was once like to be violently in love. Mr. Bennet sank into his favourite chair, buried his head in his paper, and commenced giving it much more attention than it warranted. Whilst Mrs. Phillips went on pontificating in a manner that proved her unrefined bona fides, Mrs. Bennet determined to do nothing to dissuade her sister, or preferably urge her along her way for the evening. Invariably, when the two sisters' prattling was particularly uncouth, Mr. Bennet peered over his paper and gave it a good thump as a none too subtle means of evidencing his dismay. At length, his curiosity to ascertain what had become of his second eldest daughter he no longer sought to ignore, so after a quarter of an hour passed, Mr. Bennet folded his paper, tucked it under his arm, and headed towards the door. In a matter of days, he would sequester himself in the sanctuary of his library, unencumbered by such burdensome dictates as spending time in company. As much as he did not wish to see his Lizzie stolen away to the wilds of Derbyshire, he looked forward to the calm that being a father of 2 daughters about to be married and committed to spending every waking hour in the company of their betrothed did not afford. After a while, Darcy's mood had recovered from Mrs. Bennet's untimely interruption. With any luck, there will be no more disruptions. He noted the twinkle in Elizabeth's eyes. Her teasing smile always aroused his sensibilities. Surely she knows not what she does to me. Darcy shifted in his seat. I believe it is my turn to serve you. He leaned close to Elizabeth and said, First, I require a favour of you. What is it, sir? You must close your eyes. If I do as you suggest, then how will I know when to open my mouth to accept your offering? Trust me, my love. You will know. Elizabeth was about to say something in protest, but the touch of his fingers upon her lips silenced her. Close them, he said. Otherwise, my love, I will have no recourse but to blindfold you. Merely mentioning such an enticing prospect resuscitated his former ardour. After Elizabeth did as he asked, he picked up a piece of bread and started coating it with sweet strawberry preserves. What is taking you so long? Or do you mean to starve me with anticipation? Darcy chuckled. My, are you not impatient? No doubt you are unaccustomed to the immense pleasures afforded by delayed gratification. No doubt you mean to teach me. Indeed. He brought the tiny morsel to her lips. Before Elizabeth could open her mouth, her eyes flew open and she jumped. Fighting to prevent throwing both hands in the air, Darcy dropped his hand on the table, preparing to stand. No, stay where you are, young man. Do not bother standing on my account, said Mr. Bennet. Darcy released a deep inward sigh of relief. The last thing in the world he wanted to do was stand erect just then. He surmised his future father-in-law must have deduced his predicament. Elizabeth was all too aware of Mr. Darcy's discomfort, as she was hardly in a dissimilar state, despite evidencing none of the telltale signs. Her voice higher-pitched and strained, she said, Papa, I took the liberty of preparing a repast for Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bennet held up his hand. There is no need to explain, dearest Lizzie. Now I beg the 2 of you to pardon this interruption, for you were no doubt in the middle of discussing secret affairs. I fear I may have got in the way. No, Papa. The wily elder man squinted over his spectacles. Well, whatever the manner of your intercourse, I did not mean to interrupt you. I am merely in search of my paper. Elizabeth crossed her arms over her chest. Papa, would that be the same paper you have tucked under your right arm? Feigning surprise, he pursed his lips. Well, imagine that! He shook his head. Scratching his whiskers, he said, I can only attribute my lapse to old age. Father Time is catching up with me." Again he held out his hand. "I give you two leave to carry on as you were." He continued a slow and steady pace towards the door opposite the side of the room where he had entered. "Bon appetit, young man." As glad as Darcy was to see Mr. Bennet quit the room, he considered the situation might have been far worse. By now he was hardly in the mood to resume where he had left off. Elizabeth's soft voice pierced his frustrated musings. "Mr. Darcy, I believe it is still your turn." The teasing twist of her lips was all it took to revive his flailing sentimentality. Her easy playfulness reminded him of the reason he loved her so. How unfortunate he had spent as much time as he had denying his affections. That she had been immune to his charms never once occurred to him, and only after she had declared him the last man in the world that she could be prevailed upon to marry had he realized how unworthy had been his pretenses to a woman so worthy of being pleased. Even the embarrassing goings-on in the room down the hall could not persuade him against his ardent belief of being one of the luckiest men in all of England. Her spirits rising once again to playfulness, Elizabeth, in her haste to ply Mr. Darcy with his next mouthful, spilt preserves on his crisp white cravat. Gasping, she immediately started removing the stained cloth from around his neck. Her tiny fingers, brushing his skin, stirred him. Endeavouring to bridle his desires, he seized both her wrists in his tender grip. Darcy leaned forward, slowly erasing the distance between them, and with that all semblance of propriety. Releasing her hand, he rubbed his finger along her chin. His finger tingled as it skimmed across her soft skin. Elizabeth swept her tongue over her lower lip, sending his pulse racing. Darcy's heart swelled in his chest. "If only we were at Pemberley, I would reach up and remove the pins from her hair so that it might fall loosely and sweep about her shoulders." He sighed. "It will not do, at least not now when there is the threat of interruption at any moment." Darcy's supposition that it was only a matter of time before the next disruption proved painfully true when Elizabeth's younger sister traipsed into the room. She threw her hand over her mouth in order to suppress a girlish giggle. "Oh, pardon me, Lizzie. Mr. Darcy, I was led to believe I might find Papa in here." Assuming a more decorous attitude, Elizabeth said, "I am afraid you missed Papa, Kitty." Kitty's slumping shoulders spoke to her disappointment. "What on earth is the matter, Kitty? Why do you wish to see Papa?" "Oh, I simply must speak with him at once, for I am convinced that he will agree to allow me to visit Lydia now." Kitty was on a mission that included badgering her father into submission by asking him the same question every day for over a month, hoping that he would indeed change his mind. Elizabeth released a heavy sigh. Oh, Lydia must have planted that seed in Kitty's fertile mind. Poor Kitty, albeit the older of the two, had so relied upon Lydia, and now with all the activities surrounding the two eldest sisters' nuptials of late, Kitty bewailed her feelings of being even more insignificant. Unfortunately, Kitty's pleas to Elizabeth to speak to their father on her behalf went largely ignored, and reminded Elizabeth of a missive she had received from Lydia, boasting of her imminent good fortune upon being the sister of not one, but two rich gentlemen. What good fun it would be to attend the nuptials, she had proclaimed, and oh, how exciting were the prospects for gaiety at the many balls at Netherfield Park and even Pemberley. Mr. Darcy's edict that Mr. Wickham was never to be received at Pemberley was one against which Elizabeth could hardly argue, but Mr. Bingley had never expressed such sentiments. Elizabeth supposed the gentlemen's paths would surely cross again sooner or later. I would much rather it was later, much later. Kitty was preparing to take her leave when the door swung open. In marched one of the servants, bearing a heavily laden tray, likely at Mrs. Bennet's urgings. In the blink of an eye, a lanky dog burst into the room, headlong into the servant, knocking over the tray, which then crashed onto the floor, toppling the servant, and sending a tureen of soup soaring high in the air. Moreover, where did it land? But straight atop the servant's head. It was all he could do to keep the dog from lapping the soup from his face when another dog ran into the room and also partook of the feast. Swatting the dogs away, the servant scrambled to his feet and tried to reclaim a modicum of dignity, when in rushed yet another dog, toppling the gangly young man again. A rotund servant, armed with a rolled-up newspaper, raced in behind the third dog. What a mess it was! One made even worse as the footmen took turns slipping and sliding. The havoc exacerbated further still as the dogs took turns loudly yapping and hungrily lapping up the waste. Elizabeth recognized the exasperated turn of Mr. Darcy's countenance, and although she knew she should not have enjoyed the unfolding chaos half as much as she did, she simply could not help herself. Wanting to mask her amusement with a measure of outrage she did not truly possess, one look at Kitty belied Elizabeth's intention. Wonderfully entertained, Kitty laughed and smiled in a manner Elizabeth had not seen in her for months. Espying another canine, a puppy with big round eyes, cowering in the corner of the room, Elizabeth's busy mind attempted to sort out the confusion. Though she knew not what truly set off the mayhem, Elizabeth had no doubt of its instigator, the scraggly stray that Kitty had rescued just weeks ago. Loud and long-limbed, with a tail that might as well have stretched a mile by the manner in which it disturbed everything in the dog's wake, the poor creature did not belong indoors, for she was wholly unsuitable for polite company. However, Kitty would have it no other way, insisting that her pet, which she had named Lady, was just as worthy as the other pets granted the shelter of the manor house. Supposing Kitty had adopted the mongrel as a means of placating her loneliness when her sister Lydia left, her parents did not have the heart to deny her pleas. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" All eyes turned toward the stout butler looming in the doorway. Even the yelping dogs fell silent, but only for a moment. Upon assessing the situation for himself, he proceeded to Mr. Darcy's side. "Sir, I beg your pardon. If you will bear with—" Two dogs, teeth flashing and jaws clenching, haggling over a cut of meat, ensnared themselves between the gentleman's long legs, sending him careening over the table. Darcy's wine splashed on his tan waistcoat and dark trousers. His mouth flew open. Knowing the deep crimson liquid would certainly leave a nasty stain unless she acted precipitously, Elizabeth doused a linen cloth with water. Biting her lip, she was in the midst of dabbing the offending liquid, on the verge of venturing lower, when Darcy seized hold of her wrist. Arising from his chair with utmost urgency, Darcy said, "Is there somewhere we might go to escape this madness?" "Shall we return to the parlour with the others?" Fully aware of his dishevelled state, and wanting very much to have Elizabeth all to himself, Darcy said, "No, a place where we shall enjoy privacy of an uninterruptible nature." Chapter 3. Dancing a Reel. Alone in the east parlour, the lovers' enthusiasm by now was sufficiently doused. They were alone, and with several hours remaining before they were destined to bid each other good night, they had no cause to repine. Whereas some conversation would have been in order, both seemed rather intent upon their private musings. For Elizabeth's part, the fact that Kitty had mentioned Lydia's scheme in Mr. Darcy's presence had been cause for concern. If only my entire family was privy to Mr. Darcy's kindness and the sacrifices he made in recovering Lydia, and the thousands of pounds of his own money he spent to see that she was properly settled, with the one man in the world he despised more than anyone else, owing to his treachery, they might think better of speaking of that gentleman so liberally. Then again, maybe not, for George Wickham was a member of the family, and in a matter of days he and Mr. Darcy would be akin to brothers. Oh, how Darcy's haughty aristocratic aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, had railed at such a notion, pontificating upon Pemberley's contamination because of the alliance. Elizabeth would never forget her bitterly charged assertions. "Is such a girl to be my nephew's sister? Is her husband, is the son of his late father's steward, to be his brother? Heaven and earth, of what are you thinking? Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?" A larger reason for Elizabeth's discomfort had to do with the letter she had received from Lydia, for she had not mentioned a word of its contents to Mr. Darcy. With the wedding mere days away, surely she could no longer put it off. Elizabeth drifted towards the window. She folded her arms over her bosom, partly to shield herself from the draught, but mostly to collect her thoughts. Mere moments later, strong, well-muscled arms engulfed her from behind, and she leaned into the warmth of her betrothed's embrace. "Why are you so pensive, my love?" Oh, how she relished the warmness of his breath caressing her neck. Surrendering her sweet sanctuary, she turned and faced him. Only now did she reap the benefits of having untied his stained cravat. Fighting the urge to trail her fingers along his chest, she placed her hands on his waistcoat. "Pray you will forgive me for not saying anything sooner, but I really ought to tell you that I received a letter from Lydia the other day, telling me that she plans to attend our nuptials." Darcy's expression was just as she had expected, exasperated. "In such a case as this, I know not what to say, or even what to wish." "My wish is that Lydia penned the missive without her husband's awareness, and he had the decency to persuade her against such folly before commencing the journey. Nothing pleases me more than knowing that Georgiana will be with us when we exchange vows, and yet the thought that she might be forced to suffer Mr. Wickham's company for even a second fills me with dread." "Elizabeth, it immensely pleases me that you would regard my sister's situation with such selfless consideration, even at the expense of your own sister's desires and wishes. I was exceedingly grateful when you came to Georgiana's defence against Miss Bingley's inadvertent disparagement at Pemberley, when she thought to be harming you, and instead injured my sister." Darcy placed his thumb under her chin. "I do not know that I ever thanked you." "Miss Caroline Bingley." Charles Bingley's younger of two sisters. How she loved to remind Elizabeth that George Wickham had been such a favourite of the Bennet daughters. At one time, Elizabeth had considered Mr. Wickham a better man than Mr. Darcy, despite Miss Bingley's half-informed admonitions. Caroline was wholly unaware that the nefarious Wickham had attempted to elope with Miss Darcy, and he would have succeeded had Mr. Darcy not intervened, and thus spared his sister from censure and despair. To suggest that Caroline and Elizabeth did not care for each other was hardly an exaggeration, for the former had deemed the latter an adversary from the start, a competitor for Mr. Darcy's affections. Elizabeth, having never suffered similar sentiments, did not appreciate Caroline's puffed-up pretensions and superior airs, especially her condescension towards Jane, whom Elizabeth considered the kindest, most generous person in the world. Returning her attention to the handsome man before her, Elizabeth said, "Of course you did, sir. What better means of expressing your gratitude than the manner in which you behaved upon learning of my sister's foolishness when we were together in Derbyshire?" Memories of that time haunted her still. Elizabeth's distress had been palpable, and although shocked and grieved himself, he set aside all his indignation and thought only of her comfort. His subsequent departure had rendered her pensive and regretful that she might never lay eyes on him again. But the following weeks would shed light on his motives, revealing an even better man than the one she thought she was finally beginning to understand. "I suppose I had a proper thank you in mind," said Darcy. "And what, pray tell, do you consider a more fitting expression of gratitude than all that you did on behalf of my family, which includes reuniting Jane and Mr. Bingley?" Darcy trailed his eyes along an arousing path from Elizabeth's slightly parted lips to her amazingly fine eyes, and to her lips once more. He leaned forward and bestowed a light kiss along the corner of her mouth. Both lovers wetted their lips in anticipation. A faint cough drew both of their eyes towards the door. Elizabeth's second eldest sister, Mary, sauntered into the room, saying and doing nothing that would give one the impression of her having witnessed anything untoward. Darcy, whose annoyance was barely concealed, and Elizabeth, whose embarrassment was evident, drew apart from each other. Mary said, "Aunt Phillips has gone home, and Jane and Mr. Bingley remain in the parlour." Mary pressed her spectacles to her face. "I thought I might resume practising the pieces I have selected for the wedding breakfast." Elizabeth cleared her throat. "Pray, Mary, must you practise at this very moment?" "Indeed I must, Lizzie. I shall never forget my embarrassment at the hands of those whom I considered my closest family and friends during my exhibit at the Netherfield ball. I do not mean to suffer such a harrowing trial again for as long as I live." How could Elizabeth argue with her sister? For indeed, Mary had practised all week, and still her performance had been deemed lacking, rendering her a laughing-stock to most of the people who had the misfortune of witnessing it. It concerned Elizabeth, though, that Mary spoke of her pain as poignantly as if it had happened recently, when in fact it had been a year ago. After an awkward moment, tinged with timidity, Mary ambled to the pianoforte and commenced practising. Darcy and Elizabeth took their places on the sofa. To Darcy's chagrin, Mary started with the same piece she had been practising for weeks. It would not do. Wondering if he might ever enjoy a moment alone with Elizabeth before they exchanged wedding vows, Darcy reflected on his own family's pending arrival the next day. His cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, had agreed to escort Georgiana and her companion to Hertfordshire. "Mere months ago, the thought of exposing my young sister to people who earned their living in trade would have been unconscionable." How things had changed! He owed his newly established appreciation of those in life whose circumstances were decidedly beneath his own to the affection that had grown between the Gardiners and him. They, too, would arrive the next day. In truth, his regard for Elizabeth's father also had increased. Mr. Bennet's determined stance that his daughter Kitty would never be tempted to make the same mistakes as young Lydia was proof of his goodness as a father, and his worthiness of Darcy's esteem. Footsteps clawing across the hardwood floor startled him from his musings. Darcy looked at Elizabeth. She in turn looked at him, as a pack of four-legged creatures wandered into the room and settled by the pianoforte. Moments later, a chorus of chanters, not even suited to Mary's musical talents, commenced crooning a melancholy tune. Without exchanging a single word, Elizabeth understood what must be done, not only for Mr. Darcy's sake, but for her own as well. He had incited in her busy mind questions brought on by his longing looks, and by the lingering imprint of his hands, his fingers. Her curiosity she would no longer repress, for she meant to have the answers before the evening was over. The young lovers stood, each seized the other's hand, and abandoned the room. Moments later, having reached their destination, Darcy took a second to appreciate his change in fortune. This is a charming room. Why has Elizabeth never thought to bring me here before? The well-tended fire provided the only light, for no candles were lit, giving Darcy to suspect the room was rarely used. Perhaps it was the time of the year. The aspect that heightened the room's appeal most of all was its distance from the main rooms. If not for the Scottish tune flooding the air, he could easily suppose that he and Elizabeth were alone in their own little sanctuary. "This is more to my liking." "I thought you would fancy this room, sir. However, now that we are here, and with some assurance of our privacy, I might add, whatever shall we do?" "What say you to a dance?" "Why, Mr. Darcy, do you feel a great inclination to seize an opportunity of dancing a reel?" Remembering the time at Netherfield Park when he had taunted her with words of a similar vein, he smiled apologetically. Besides, a reel was the furthest thing from his mind. "Do you suppose your sister might be persuaded to practice another piece?" "I suppose she might. What do you have in mind?" "Actually, I was considering something more suited to a waltz." Elizabeth placed her hand to her bosom. "I am afraid you do not know my sister very well if you suppose for one moment that she would consent to such a scandalous proposal." He extended his hand to her. "Then I suppose we shall have to make do with this." Darcy placed his free hand on Elizabeth's waist and drew her much closer than any ballroom would have allowed, sending a surge of heat all over her body. She endeavoured not to think of what anyone who came upon them at that moment would think, and instead placed her hand on his shoulder and commenced following his lead. They were well into the dance when the music had stopped, but that did not deter them. Their bodies swaying in the same rhythmic motion, Darcy said, "You cannot imagine how much I longed to hold you like this during our first dance." "Of course it might have been our second dance, had you deemed me tolerable enough to tempt you during the Meryton assembly." "I did not mean for you to hear me." "I suppose that is your idea of an apology." "Must I remind you that you subsequently spurned my request for a dance at Lucas Lodge, and in so doing wounded me deeply?" "Sir, I rather doubt that I wounded you, for surely you would never have asked had Sir Lucas not prodded you." "Elizabeth, do you suppose that I do not bleed when cut?" "Well, if you insist, then I suppose that makes us even." Halting the dance, Darcy bent towards Elizabeth and peered into her eyes. "May you and I never do or say anything that would cause us to wound each other again." Moving his hand to her face, Darcy brushed his thumb along her lips. How he adored her! The thought that he might ever again utter a single word that might cause her displeasure was unfathomable. He pressed his lips to her forehead, her eyebrows, her cheekbones, the corners of her mouth, affording scintillating chills in his wake. Pausing between each kiss, he looked at her beautiful face. At length, he brushed his lips against hers. His eyes closed. He proceeded gently, slowly urging her lips apart. Her response was everything he wished it would be. Their tongues commenced a swirling, teasing dance, and soon their desire for each other took on a violent, titillating urgency. Breathless, Elizabeth placed her hands on his chest and gently eased herself away from his kiss. "We must not." "We must not what, Elizabeth?" "I do not think now is the time, and I most certainly do not think this is the place to succumb to our bodies' screams." He brushed his thumb across her slightly swollen lips. "As much as I would like to answer the call, the truth is, my love, I am not that selfish." She tilted her head to one side and studied his face. "Selfish, sir?" "Indeed. for it would be the epitome of selfishness for me to exercise such liberties at this particular time and place. While I would no doubt find it pleasurable and immensely satisfying, I do not know that you would do the same. In fact, in light of your innocence, I am rather certain you would not. I want our first time to be special. The two of us together, as man and wife, in our wedding bed. Sir, I insist you elaborate on the basis of such a presumptuous assertion that what is deemed pleasurable for you would not be equally pleasurable for me. Presumptuous? I merely speak the truth. How do you suppose? I am a man of 28. How do you think I am privy to certain truths? I imagine as a man of sense and education who has knowledge of the world, you might have seen and done things I can scarcely conceive. Darcy said nothing. He threaded his fingers through his hair and then walked to the sofa and sat. Elizabeth joined him. Perhaps you might tell me about it, as we are to be husband and wife, and I suppose I ought to know. I think not. What is more, I have no intention of discussing such matters. But what if our situations were reversed? Darcy swallowed hard. Then I would have every right to know. However, as the situations are not reversed, this discussion is completely beyond the pale. Bending her knee and tucking her foot beneath her, Elizabeth shifted her body and faced him head-on. Pray, Mr. Darcy, you will not be the sort of husband who believes a spouse's rights are principally inherent in one's gender. For if that is indeed the case, tell me now, and I shall know how to act. Darcy assumed the same attitude as his betrothed. What manner of retribution might I endure, if in fact that is the case? Well, sir, for one, I might be rather less welcoming than a husband expects of his bride. You would not dare. Do not tempt me. Should you do as you suggest, then I would have no choice other than to resort to any measure of stratagems and schemes to achieve my purposes. However, I do not imagine it ever coming to that. Once I have made you mine, no doubt you will become hopelessly addicted. Fear not, however, for having attested to my generosity, you can be assured that I will indulge your avid appetite with ardent alacrity. You seem rather certain of yourself, sir. By now, Elizabeth's face was within an inch of his. Which brings me to my original question. What is the basis for your assertions? Chapter 4. Cause to Repine. Darcy strode to the door and turned the key. Turning and facing Elizabeth, he pressed his shoulders up against the door. At last, there will be no more interruptions. Whatever are you doing, Mr. Darcy? Standing, she placed her hands about her hips. Do you not suppose that the prospect of finding the two of us locked behind closed doors will meet with a stern measure of disapproval from my papa? He swept his eyes over Elizabeth's body. I much prefer he finds us locked behind closed doors than find us locked in the position I have in mind. Oh? And pray, what position do you have in mind? With long strides, he returned to her side, dropped down on the sofa, and pulled her into his arms. I would rather show you. After persuading her to sit astride his lap, he grasped both her hands and gently kissed the inside of her wrists. There are consequences for your behavior in the dining parlor. She placed her hands on his shoulders. Her heart palpitated as she grazed her fingers along the strong column of his neck. Am I to be punished for doing whatever I must to ensure my future husband is well nourished? On the contrary, I mean to reward you properly for your care and attention to my appetite. However, in sating one hunger, your considerations have given wake to another." Elizabeth's lips parted slightly. Darcy said, "Indeed, have I not confessed to being a selfish man all my life? There are certain vices I simply refuse to surrender." No longer concerned with untimely interruptions, he removed the pins from her hair and proceeded to admire the way it cascaded over her shoulders and down her back. The sparkling fire bathing the room with its radiance only heightened the sensual intrigue. Nothing could take away from this moment, not even Mary's laboured practising once again flooding Longbourn's corridors. Elizabeth peered into his eyes, dark and alluring, rendering him even more attractive than she would have allowed just a few months ago. She reached up and traced the pattern of his chiseled jaw. She kissed his cheek as he bent towards her. Her breathing unsteady, her heartbeat pounding so loudly that surely he heard it too, she lowered her hand and brushed his chest with her fingers. She then rested her head in the curve of his neck. Being with him like this, touching him like this, and being touched by him like this, all while comforted by the sense of security a locked door afforded, emboldened her. Not truly knowing what she was about, the feelings he incited in her were sufficient that she was content to throw caution to the wind and follow his lead, wherever it took them. He pulled her face towards his and grazed his lips along her mouth before granting a deep, penetrating kiss. While giving his fingers leave to pursue the path he had longed to embark upon while they were in the dining parlour, Darcy recalled the first time he leaned towards Elizabeth and pressed his lips against hers. Slow, tender, and ever so brief, the first kiss of many to follow. However, this kiss was certainly different. She was used to his kisses by now, and she met them with a sense of wanting, longing for more. He could not wait to make her his wife. Their bodies melded instinctively. Her softness against his hardness, her pleasing gyrations, and her soft gasps gratified him immensely. Darcy relished the exquisiteness of her soft lips, her tongue, and the sweet taste of strawberries. Their season of courtship had afforded many notable pleasures, but none so intoxicating as this. "We have but 2 nights more before the wedding. 2 nights. If I could conclude each of them in such a manner as this, I would have no cause whatsoever for discontent." The effect she had on Darcy did not escape Elizabeth. Indeed, it fascinated her. Her youngest sister's way of finding a husband had nearly ruined her family, and therefore was not something that Elizabeth liked to dwell upon. Nevertheless, she now understood how a young girl who fancied herself in love might yield to the temptations afforded in the arms of a proficient lover. It is not that I mean to suppose for one instant that George Wickham is proficient. Egad, why am I even thinking of George Wickham at such a moment as this? Oh yes, it is because my youngest sister has experienced that which I have been given only to wonder about in the privacy of my bedroom on more than one occasion since my engagement to Fitzwilliam. Too many evenings had ended with her heart in knots over the prospect of being separated from him for an entire night. Thus the reason for her eagerness to set off early in the mornings to meet him on one of their favourite secluded paths. They would hold hands and stroll along, sometimes in quiet companionship, sometimes in heated debate, and always in view of the rising sun. She simply wanted to be with him. Be it fascination or be it infatuation, be it love or be it lust, or better yet, be it the best combination of all those things, she was certain she never wished to be parted from him. How thankful she was that he had arranged his business affairs so he could spend the majority of his time in Hertfordshire, and that those instances that found him in town often found her in town as well, visiting the gardeners in Cheapside. None of our time together has been as pleasant as this. Swifter than she might have supposed, he shifted their positions and covered her body with his. He reclaimed her lips. Elizabeth's heart pounded against her chest. He must feel it too. She gave some thought to protesting, to exercising a measure of restraint in keeping with her maidenly sensibilities, but her body's aching thirst for something yet unexperienced screamed louder. How she relished the intoxicating touch of his lips upon her neckline, her face, her lips. Longing for him to possess every fibre of her being, Elizabeth reminded herself to breathe. If I can have but one wish, I wish this night never ends. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, as well as Mary and Kitty, had long since retired for the evening, as had been their wont, thus affording the engaged couples a measure of privacy before their gentlemen callers were fully expected to take their leave. Concerned that he had not seen Darcy since his friend muttered some excuse before quitting the room hours earlier, Bingley ran his fingers through his hair. "Perhaps I should gather Darcy so we might return to Netherfield together. Despite the short distance, I am always glad for his company."
"It has been some time since we last saw Lizzie or Mr. Darcy, and the hour is late. Perhaps he has taken his leave already."
Bingley shook his head. "Given the direction of your aunt's discourse this evening, I am not surprised that Darcy sought a means of escaping her company, but it is not like him to depart without informing me." Reaching out her hand to touch his, Jane said,
"Again, you must allow me to apologize for my aunt's behaviour."
He placed his free hand over her hand resting lovingly on his other, and smiled. "My dearest Jane, you have no reason to apologize to me. I hold you no more accountable for your family's behaviour than you hold me liable for mine. Soon enough we shall all be one happy family." Jane's face lit up.
"Indeed, as I am already the happiest woman in all of England, there can be little doubt of your assertions."
How her sweet angelic smile warmed his heart. He squeezed her hand. "What say you we have a look around for Darcy and Miss Elizabeth?" They set off in search of the couple, first checking the dining parlour where Kitty's intelligence had last placed them, and then the east parlour, as well as a few adjacent rooms. All their efforts proved futile. Indeed, no one wandered throughout the halls. Given the hour, Jane was not surprised to see none of the servants stirring. Before allowing that Mr. Darcy had indeed returned to Netherfield, Jane had an idea where her sister and future brother might be. Although merely speculation, she recalled her sister had sought the solace of that particular room a time or two of late. She turned to Mr. Bingley.
"Pray follow me."
Arriving at her destination, Jane placed her hand on the doorknob and gave it a twist. Supposing that it was jammed, she applied a bit more pressure.
"This is strange."
"What is the matter?"
"The door. It appears to be stuck."
"Allow me." Jane moved aside, and Bingley placed his hand on the doorknob, taking care to provide just the right amount of finesse to assure his betrothed that he was more than capable of handling such matters. "The door is not stuck. He scratched his head. "It's locked."
"How can that be?"
Jane threw her hand over her mouth.
"You do not suppose—"
Bingley pressed his ear against the door. Her voice now an excited whisper, Jane said,
"What on earth are you doing?"
He placed his finger to his lips. Speaking softly, he said, "I'm trying to listen to anything I might overhear."
"Sir, pray come away from the door."
Bingley shook his head and beckoned Jane to his side.
"Come, listen."
She crossed her arms beneath her breasts.
"I will do no such thing."
With both hands now pressed against the door, cupping his ear, Bingley persisted.
"I think I hear something."
Jane then assumed the same attitude as her betrothed.
"I do not hear anything."
Bingley hushed her.
"Listen closely."
A barely perceptible sound escaped the locked room.
"Did you hear that?"
Jane eased away.
"Whatever shall we do? Surely my sister and Mr. Darcy have lost track of the hour. Shall we knock on the door and garner their attention?"
Bingley's decision to do nothing of the sort was not long in the making.
"Most assuredly, if Jane and I were on the other side of this door, I would not wish to be disturbed. Besides, Darcy and Miss Elizabeth are days away from becoming man and wife. What could be the harm?" "Mr. Bingley?"
His ears still pressed against the door, he hushed Jane again.
"Sir, if you do not mean to knock, then certainly we should not be doing this. Come away from the door."
Optimism graced his countenance. Relinquishing his spot, Bingley captured Jane's hand. He raised it to his lips and brushed a kiss across her knuckles.
"Jane, dearest, perhaps you and I might—" "Mr. Bingley!"
Just as it happened every morning at Longbourn, the call of blackbirds chirping outside the window coaxed open Elizabeth's eyes. Her thoughts upon waking this particular morning were unlike any ever before.
"I fell asleep in Fitzwilliam's arms."
She swept her fingers through her hair. She knew not whether to be alarmed by her discovery or comforted by his continued presence.
"Surely no one is aware of his being here, or else the household would be in an uproar."
A slight chill made her appreciate the warmth of her lover's embrace. A sidelong glance at the hearth confirmed her supposition that the fire had died hours earlier. A few faint embers pierced the darkness, enough for her to discern Darcy's stunning mien.
How innocent his beautiful face!
Elizabeth did not have the heart to awaken him and send him on his way, but awaken him she must. Soon a servant would require entrance into the room to build the fire. Recalling the locked door, she rested her head on his chest.
"I think I shall enjoy this moment a bit longer."
Dreams of amorous interludes with his lovely Elizabeth had served as his nocturnal companions for many months. Somewhere between sleep and consciousness, Darcy had a sense of not wanting this particular dream to end. As he had done countless times before, he would simply turn over and resume their love-making a few hours more. However, the smell of her sweet fragrance, the sensation of softness pressed against his firmness, and the gentle brush of her breath across his chest gave him to know this was no ordinary dream. His eyes shot open. Aside from his jacket, which he now recalled having removed last night, situated over the back of the sofa, the rest of his attire, and even his hessians, were where they ought to be. He released a deep breath. Unable to resist, he brushed his fingers through Elizabeth's loosened tresses. Elizabeth lifted her head.
"You are awake."
"How long has it been since you awakened, Elizabeth?"
"Not long."
"Why did you not awaken me?"
"I simply could not bear the thought of your awaking and leaving me. I thought I might savour this moment for as long as possible."
"What time is it?"
"Why, Mr. Darcy, are you worried that my papa might find you here and insist that you marry me in order to save my reputation?"
Darcy shifted their positions, and before Elizabeth knew what he was about, he was on top of her.
If I am to be accused of ruining your reputation, my love, at the very least, I should do the job properly."
"Then you consider all the liberties you stole last night as insufficient?"
He tucked an errant lock of hair behind her ear. "I do not recall hearing any complaints at the time."
"Perhaps it is because I was not thinking clearly. However, having spent an entire night in your arms, the dawn of a new day has awakened me to the fact that some manner of protest is warranted, or else I shall be regarded as wanton. It would never do for the future mistress of Pemberley to be looked upon as such."
"You must allow the master of Pemberley to decide such things. That being said, when we are together like this, wanton is the only way I wish to describe you."
"Mr. Darcy!"
"Elizabeth," he murmured. He commenced his adorations in a manner pleasantly reminiscent of how they had left off last evening. Elizabeth's soft moans only encouraged him. Not wanting to miss bearing witness to the flux of emotions his ardent ministrations elicited in his ladylove, Darcy opened his eyes. Bright sun rays poking through the shades recalled him to their surroundings. Surrendering the sweet taste of her skin, he slowly swept his fingers through her hair. Upon standing, he retrieved his jacket from the back of the sofa and folded it over his arm. His modesty discreetly intact owing to his purposeful placement of his jacket, he said, "I really must be leaving." Her countenance flushed. Elizabeth sat up.
"But—"
A mixture of frustration, disappointment, and wistfulness laced her voice.
When shall you return?"
"I shall return this afternoon."
"This afternoon? I do not know that I can wait that long. I am most eager for us to...
Elizabeth stood and pressed her hands against his chest. She rested her head thereupon. His heart's tempo comforted her, while his pleasant-smelling manly scent aroused her. If she could but command time to stand still, she might enjoy his nearness a while longer. A breathless whisper escaped her lips.
"Is it your intention to taunt me?"
"I should like to hear you tell me what you were about to say." She lifted her head, and their eyes met.
"Sir, you have awakened desires in me that I should very much like to explore further."
He brushed his hand along her chin. "And we will, in mere days, once we are man and wife."
"And what shall I do in the meantime, sir?"
Darcy slipped his arms around her slender waist. "Think of me doing this." He urged her body closer to his, so she would have some indication of her power over him. "And this." He feathered kisses along her smooth shoulders and the soft skin of her neckline. "And this." Darcy kissed her passionately until the need to breathe persuaded their lips apart. He rested his forehead against hers. "As I surely will be thinking of you."
Chapter 5. All her maternal feelings. Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet attended Jane and Elizabeth's nuptials to Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, respectively. The wealthy gentleman who had caused such a stir in the neighbourhood just over a year earlier. The final days leading up to the blessed occasion, however, had been in Elizabeth's mind a torment, brimming with uncertainty, nervous anticipation, and a longing for her betrothed that she could scarcely deny. Such had been all that, as well as a particularly embarrassing moment when it was all Elizabeth could do to maintain her composure when her mother took Jane and her aside and explained what was expected of them in the marriage bed. Elizabeth was certain that if what her betrothed had taught her to expect was true, and she strongly suspected it was, then her mother was woefully misinformed. On this occasion, Elizabeth thought it best to keep her supposition to herself. Though she would have gladly confided in Jane all that had transpired when she spent the night behind a locked door with Mr. Darcy, she truly did not have the words to describe her experience aptly. Because Jane did not ask, Elizabeth said nothing at all. Indeed, if anyone knew Mr. Darcy had spent the night at Longbourn, the knowledge went unspoken. To Elizabeth's chagrin, the remaining time was spent in company awash with her Aunt Phillips's vulgarity, her mother's absurdities, and her father's scrutiny. No one was more pleased by the arrival of Darcy's sister Georgiana and his cousin Colonel Fitzwilliam than was Elizabeth. Having formed an acquaintance with the latter whilst in Kent, and having met him subsequently in London, Elizabeth was certain the amiable gentleman would be well received amongst her Hertfordshire acquaintances. The arrival of her aunt and uncle from town rendered her satisfaction complete. However much it could be said that Mrs. Bennet was happy to get rid of her two most deserving daughters on that blessed December day, happier still was Mr. Darcy. The wedding breakfast had barely got under way before the Darcys were in a luxury barouche on the road to town. Darcy was eager to have his wife all to himself. Hence, they were to spend their first week as man and wife in his London home before journeying to Pemberley. The scheme necessitated a return trip to Longbourn village, where he intended to squander as little time as possible before whisking Elizabeth away to Derbyshire. Georgiana had formed a steady acquaintance with Mary and Kitty through the frequent exchanging of letters during the past weeks. And as Elizabeth had subsequently received her own correspondence from Lydia, lamenting how she and her dear Wickham would not be there for the nuptials, and decrying their lack of funds as the reason, Darcy was persuaded to allow his sister to remain at Longbourn with her companion until he and Elizabeth returned. The arrangement also suited Elizabeth, for it pleased her husband immensely, and allowed her to spend time with her most beloved sister Jane, and enjoy a proper goodbye with her Hertfordshire friends and relations. The past weeks of courtship had taught Elizabeth to relinquish a bit of her fierce independence, and put her unwavering trust in her husband, as evidenced by the blindfold fashioned from one of his crisp white cravats that she had allowed him to tie in place over her eyes. What's more, she had promised not to peek unless or until he granted her permission. This was not at all as she had expected for her wedding night. Although she rather suspected her mother's advice had been wrong, she was wholly surprised to be in such a situation as this. Her spirited sense of adventure would not allow her to protest. Elizabeth's hand fastened around his muscular, protective arm as he held the other in his tender grip, and slowly coaxed her, one tentative footstep after another, until they had walked for some distance. Having no notion of her surroundings, the warmth of the fire and its smooth crackle further soothed her inhibitions. Her senses heightened by lack of sight, she appreciated even more the soft silky feel of her negligee against her skin. She perceived with utter pleasure the fragrance of freshly cut flowers and hints of oranges and lemons lingering in the air. When Darcy assisted her in seating, she traced her fingers along fine leather, a deep rich burgundy, she surmised. She drew an excited breath. Do I detect vanilla? Elizabeth exhaled. Oh, how I love the taste of vanilla. Prepare yourself for something wonderful, my love, he whispered. The sound of his voice and the soft touch of his fingers upon her lips made her shiver. Eager to accept whatever tantalizing treats he had in store for her, Elizabeth opened her mouth and received his offering. Hot steam caressed her lips, and for a moment she supposed he was serving her tea. Slowly she sipped. Not tea. Arresting impulses stirred her. All at once, a burst of ecstasy exploded in her mouth. Her heart pounded against her chest. She swept her fingers through her loosened hair. Whatever this is, a blissful surge washed over her. I want more. Did you enjoy that? Elizabeth's soft moan signified the depths of her pleasure. She traced her tongue across her lower lip, moistening it, and savouring every lingering taste of the divine gift her husband had bestowed. Here comes another. Not knowing was simply too much for a woman of Elizabeth's constitution to endure. Filled with wonder over what had been the means of such intoxicating joy, she ripped the blindfold from her head and tossed it aside. That was by far the most delectable thing I ever tasted in all my life. Pray, what is it? Mrs. Darcy, you promised you would do as I told. After setting aside the cup, Darcy brushed his finger along Elizabeth's chin and peered deeply into her eyes. So much for the vows you swore just this morning. You do recall to honour and obey? She darted her eyes. We have the rest of our lives to dwell upon all that. Now I have more urgent matters to attend. A silver tray, fully laden with fresh oranges, lemons, grapes, even a pineapple, a particular delicacy that was not to be found at Longbourn during any time of the year, lay before her. She reached for the porcelain cup, caressed it with both hands, pressed it to her lips, and took a sip. Her senses awakened once again, only this time with more intensity than the first. Parts of her ascended the physical world, piercing another realm. What is this? It is chocolate, my love. I thought surely you would have had it before, albeit not as potent as this. I had this blend imported from... His words melded into the background as Elizabeth took yet another swallow, closed her eyes, and allowed her sensibilities to take her where they would. If that be over the edge of the plateau looming inside her, so be it. At length, his voice pierced her exhilarated oblivion. I know what you are thinking. Supposing the intense satisfaction she derived as the sumptuous brew unleashed ripples of excitement, a literal explosion of delight that started in her mouth and cascaded all over her body, was uniquely and incandescently her own, she opened her eyes and regarded him with unabashed wonderment. How can he possibly know what I am thinking when I hardly know myself? She asked him as much. First, you are meditating on the pleasures to be enjoyed from a cup of steaming hot, rich, luxurious chocolate. You are wondering how something so seemingly simple as this can have the power to summon tiny swells of delight that promise to explode into thousands of waves of overwhelming pleasure all over your body, from your mouth to your arms, your legs, and the tip of your toes. What is more, you want to upbraid yourself for having gone all your life and never having partaken of such a pleasurable, one might even say decadent, experience before. Even now, you are scarcely listening to a word I speak. Your mind is intent upon one thing, your undeniable, dare I say inexplicable, craving for your next mouthful. Elizabeth swallowed hard. It is as if he knows things about me that I have yet to comprehend myself. Oh, the number of occasions she had foregone this heavenly drink and chosen instead her favourite hot tea. Indeed. His wife's flushed skin and the gentle rise and fall of her bosom filled him with anticipation and aroused his hopes. He leaned nearer. "I will venture further to say that what you felt is nothing in comparison to what I have in store for you, my love." Her present circumstances easily persuaded her that she had sufficient cause to doubt the veracity of his claim. Yes, she enjoyed his kisses immensely, and she dared not deny the awakening of desires wholly unfamiliar, albeit pleasant, to her when she was in his arms, especially the evening spent behind the locked door. However, this rich confection more than quenched a thirst she never even knew she had. Hers was an experience mere words could scarcely describe. What more can he possibly have in store that might tempt me to forsake this wonderful treasure? In the blink of an eye, Darcy swept Elizabeth up in his arms and stepped away from the table. A frisson of panic, akin to being separated, perhaps forever, from a most beloved companion, erupted deep inside her. "Pray do not forget the chocolate." "I assure you, Mrs. Darcy, by the time this night is over," his warm breath caressed her ear, "chocolate will be the furthest thing from your mind." This has been Pride and Sensuality, a Darcy and Elizabeth short story, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Copyright 2014 by P.O. Dixon. Production copyright 2014 by P.O. Dixon.